Mila thought catching her fiancé with her best friend on her wedding day was the ultimate disaster. But as the heavy scent of expensive sandalwood and fresh gunpowder filled the dark interior of the idling Maybach, she realized she had just made a fatal miscalculation. She was in the wrong getaway car, and the cold steel of a handgun barrel was pressed firmly against her temple. What happens when the ultimate betrayal meets the ultimate protector? Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and buckle up because you will not want to miss a single second of this ride. 10 minutes earlier, the cathedral was buzzing with 1,000 elite guests waiting for the exchange of vows. Mila had slipped away to the electrical room, searching for a rogue event coordinator, but instead, she found Julian. Her billionaire trust fund fiancé had her maid of honor pinned against the main breaker panel, too busy tearing at the woman's silk gown to notice the heavy door swinging open. There were no tears as Mila's shock bypassed sorrow and crystallized entirely into calculating, razor-sharp rage. Rather than scream and give them the satisfaction of a public breakdown, she stepped silently into the room, reached over the thrashing couple, grabbed the heavy industrial lever of the main generator, and pulled it down. The massive cathedral plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Amidst the sudden chorus of panic echoing from the nave, Mila turned on her heel. She navigated the pitch-black service corridors strictly by memory, while the heavy layers of her $20,000 tulle skirt caught and tore on sharp corners, ruining the designer fabric. Bursting through the rusted back exit into the humid alleyway, the flashbulbs of ravenous paparazzi immediately blinded her. Desperate to escape the flashing cameras, she spotted the idling, blacked-out SUV waiting by the dumpsters. Assuming it was her arranged transport, she yanked the heavy door open, threw herself onto the plush leather seats and slammed it shut, exhaling a ragged breath. That was when the gun touched her skin. The man holding the weapon did not flinch, sitting completely still in the shadows, immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. His eyes, completely devoid of warmth, locked onto her. It was Heo Daewon, the terrifying head of the Shadow Syndicate, and Julian's estranged, untouchable uncle. "Give me one reason," Daewon murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that filled the confined space. "I shouldn't paint my upholstery with your brains, little bride." The cold metal of the barrel rested flush against her skin. Mila didn't flinch, refusing to give the man holding the weapon the satisfaction of her terror. She slowly shifted her gaze from the semi-automatic to the face of Heo Daewon. Even in the dim light of the tinted SUV, his features were ruthlessly sharp, exuding a quiet, terrifying authority. "If you pull that trigger," Mila said, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic racing of her pulse, "the cleanup is going to cost you a fortune. I'll gladly pay to dry clean your leather seats if you just tell your driver to step on the gas." Daewon's dark eyes narrowed as he studied her face, taking in the flawless bridal makeup, the ruined cascade of expensive white tulle spilling over his charcoal trousers, and the unmistakable lack of fear in her expression. The tension in the confined space was heavy, thick with the scent of his expensive sandalwood cologne. He didn't lower the weapon. Instead, he leaned forward, closing the fraction of space between them. The proximity was dangerous, stealing the air from her lungs. "You're the Johnson heiress," Daewon stated, not framing it as a question. "Julian's bride." "Ex-bride, as of 5 minutes ago," Mila corrected, smoothing a torn piece of lace on her lap with forced casualness. "Unless he plans on marrying the backup generator." A profound silence settled over the heavy, bulletproof vehicle as Daewon stared at her, the calculating machinery of his mind working flawlessly. Julian needed this marriage today to access the family trust, a massive block of proxy shares that Daewon's syndicate required to neutralize Julian's father completely. If Julian failed to secure a wife by midnight, those shares defaulted. But if Daewon secured her instead, the game changed. Slowly, deliberately, Daewon lowered the handgun, placing it on the center console. He pressed a button, and the heavy mechanical thud of the central locking system echoed through the cabin. Mila stiffened. "What are you doing?" "Recalculating," Daewon replied smoothly, reaching into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and producing a sleek silver fountain pen. He held it out to her, his gaze unwavering. "Julian needs your signature on a marriage certificate to inherit his grandfather's voting shares. My syndicate needs those shares permanently liquidated. You want to ruin the man who humiliated you, and I want to erase his branch of the family from my board." Mila stared at the silver pen, then up at his lethal, unreadable face. "Marry me right now, Mila Johnson," Daewon commanded softly, the deep velvet of his tone masking the absolute danger of his proposition. "Sign your name next to mine, and I will personally ensure your ex-fiancé spends the rest of his miserable life kneeling in the dirt." An hour later, the heavy mahogany doors of the family enterprise's 75th floor boardroom did not merely open, they yielded to a violent, echoing force. Inside, Julian had abandoned the ruined cathedral to do damage control, standing at the head of the expansive glass table, his tie loosened, frantically assuring a dozen high-level executives and syndicate lawyers that his bride's absence was a minor medical delay. His panicked excuses died instantly in his throat. Mila stepped over the threshold, leaning lightly on the immaculate arm of Heo Daewon. The opulent air conditioning of the corporate suite bit at her skin, but she was shielded by the heavy, expensive wool of Daewon's oversized charcoal suit jacket, draped protectively over her ruined white gown. The stark contrast of the torn tulle sweeping across the polished marble floor commanded absolute silence. Julian's arrogant face drained of all color, his eyes darting from the trailing lace of Mila's dress to the terrifying, familiar silhouette of the man beside her. "Uncle," Julian choked out, the words scraping against the sudden, suffocating quiet of the room. "What is this? What are you doing with my fiancé?" Daewon did not acknowledge his nephew, simply guiding Mila forward with a firm, warm hand pressed against the small of her back. The physical anchor kept her spine rigid, projecting a regal composure she barely felt. "Gentlemen," Daewon addressed the table, his voice a low, lethal hum that demanded total submission. "I apologize for interrupting the audit. However, there has been a permanent adjustment to the trust distribution." Julian scrambled forward, planting his hands on the glass. "Mila, get away from him. He's dangerous. You don't know who he is." "I know exactly who he is, Julian," Mila interrupted, her voice ringing clear and steady. The satisfaction of watching him unravel was a potent, intoxicating rush. "He's the man who doesn't sleep with my maid of honor next to a high-voltage breaker." A collective murmur rippled through the seated executives, and Julian flushed a violent shade of red, opening his mouth to yell a defense, but Daewon moved first. With a smooth, calculated motion, Daewon reached into his inner pocket and tossed a crisp, legally bound document onto the center of the table. It slid across the glass, stopping perfectly in front of the lead trust attorney. "The proxy shares tied to the Johnson merger are no longer pending," Daewon stated, his dark eyes finally locking onto Julian's trembling frame. "They are officially secured. As of 20 minutes ago, the bride fulfilled her contractual obligation." Julian stared at the freshly inked signatures on the marriage certificate, his chest heaving as the reality of his total bankruptcy set in, and he looked up, utterly destroyed. You, Julian stammered, backing away. Daewon tilted his head, his expression devoid of all mercy. Address my wife with respect, Julian, or I will have you removed from my building. The private elevator ascended 70 floors in absolute silence, opening directly into a sprawling, minimalist fortress of glass and steel. Daewon's penthouse was stark, stripped of any personal warmth, functioning more as a high-altitude vault than a home. The city lights of the sprawling metropolis glowed far below them, rendering the space incredibly quiet. Mila let the oversized charcoal suit jacket slip from her shoulders, dropping it onto a sleek leather sofa. "So, this is where the villain lives," she noted, her tone dry and exhausted. Daewon walked to a marble wet bar, pouring a measure of dark amber liquid into a crystal glass. "This is where the board members believe my wife lives," he corrected smoothly, walking back and offering her the drink. "The arrangement is straightforward. You have unrestricted access to my security detail, the accounts, and this floor. You do not inquire about my external operations, and in public, we maintain the illusion of a sudden, blinding infatuation." Blinding infatuation. Right. Mila set the untouched glass on the counter. "Before we practice our loving gazes, I need to get out of this armor." She reached blindly behind her back, her fingers searching for the hidden zipper buried beneath heavy layers of tight boning and stiff silk. She pulled, but the delicate metal track refused to budge, hopelessly jammed from her frantic sprint through the cathedral alleyway. She strained her arms, twisting awkwardly, but the fabric only tightened around her ribs. Mila exhaled a sharp breath of frustration, dropping her hands. "It's completely stuck." Daewon placed his glass next to hers, crossing the expansive living room with footsteps making no sound on the polished, dark wood. He stopped directly behind her, the proximity immediately stealing the air from her lungs. "Turn," he instructed. Mila hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning her back to him. The atmosphere in the room shifted, growing heavy, as Daewon's tall frame eclipsed the ambient light. His large, warm hands brushed against the bare skin of her shoulder blades, sending an involuntary electric current down her spine. The contrast between his ruthless boardroom demeanor and the careful, methodical way his fingers navigated the ruined lace was deeply disorienting. "You are holding your breath," he murmured, his voice a low, velvet vibration right beside her ear as he finally dislodged the jammed metal. The zipper slid down, loosening the heavy bodice instantly, and Mila dragged in a deep breath of air, suddenly dizzy. She turned her head slightly, finding his face mere inches from hers. The severe lines of his expression had softened, his dark eyes fixed intensely on her profile. The silence between them stretched, thick and dangerous. Then the deafening crack of a high-caliber rifle tore through the night. The floor-to-ceiling window beside them exploded inward in a violent storm of raining glass. Gravity vanished as Daewon tackled her to the hardwood floor, shielding her body with his own, while broken glass cascaded over his suit. The deafening echo of the rifle shot faded into the wail of distant city sirens. He was on his feet in a fraction of a second, drawing a weapon from an ankle holster she hadn't noticed. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a flat, terrifying calm. "I am going to find the man on the opposite roof. My perimeter team will secure the window." He vanished through the heavy oak doors. 10 minutes later, the private elevator chimed, and 3 men in dark maintenance uniforms stepped into the ruined living room, carrying heavy canvas tarps. Mila rose slowly from behind the leather sofa, brushing debris from her torn tulle skirt. She watched the men spread the canvas, her event coordinator instincts, honed by years of micromanaging suspicious vendors, flaring instantly. The lead worker's boots were scuffed steel toe, not the silent, tactical footwear Daewon's men wore. Furthermore, his hands were trembling slightly as he surveyed the opulent room. "Mr. Ho sent us.
The lead man grunted, stepping uncomfortably close. "You need to come with us, ma'am, for your safety." Mila didn't move. Daewon's private security doesn't announce themselves, and they certainly don't track mud onto a bespoke Persian rug, she noted, her tone laced with severe annoyance. "Julian's father hired you, didn't he? A budget cleanup crew sent to intimidate a woman in a torn dress." The man's jaw tightened. "Listen, lady, the old man just wants the contract you signed. Give it to us, and we walk." "The contract is locked in a biometric safe," Mila lied smoothly, crossing her arms. She needed to buy exactly 3 minutes. "And even if I could open it, you aren't equipped to survive the alarm system." "We'll take our chances," the leader sneered, losing his patience. He lunged forward, his thick fingers clamping roughly around her bare upper arm. Mila didn't scream, but the heavy mechanical hum of the private elevator engaging broke the silence. The steel doors parted, and Daewon stepped into the foyer. The air pressure in the penthouse seemed to evaporate as Daewon took in the broken window, the unfamiliar men, and finally the heavy, dirty hand gripping Mila's skin. He didn't yell, and he didn't draw his weapon. He simply tilted his head, his dark eyes void of any humanity. "Take your hand off my wife," Daewon whispered.
The thug dropped his hand as if the skin beneath his fingers had suddenly caught fire. Daewon didn't waste a single syllable on a warning, crossing the broken glass in 2 silent, predatory strides. Mila only saw the blur of a crisp white shirt before Daewon's hand locked onto the leader's collar, driving the much larger man and his 2 scrambling subordinates backward into the foyer. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, abruptly severing the view. Mila stood perfectly still in the ruined living room, while from the other side of the thick wood there were 3 distinct, heavy impacts, followed by absolute, chilling silence. When the doors opened a minute later, Daewon walked back in alone. He adjusted the silver cufflinks of his shirt with methodical precision. His breathing was entirely even, but a thin ribbon of crimson tracked down the sharp angle of his jaw, dripping onto his immaculate collar. "The perimeter is secure," he announced smoothly, stepping over the debris. "Did they harm you?" Mila exhaled, her event coordinator pragmatism immediately overriding the lingering adrenaline. "I'm fine. You're bleeding." Daewon reached up, his fingers brushing the fresh cut along his jawline. "A minor miscalculation with a hidden blade." "Sit," she instructed, pointing toward the heavy marble island in the kitchen. "Before you ruin a $3,000 shirt." A faint, genuine trace of amusement softened his severe features as he complied, resting his hands on his thighs. Mila navigated the wreckage to retrieve a polished silver first aid kit from the master bathroom. When she returned, she stepped directly into his space, standing intimately close between his parted knees, and uncapped a small bottle of antiseptic. The sheer physical scale of him up close was overwhelming. She pressed a damp cotton pad to his jaw, her touch light and precise, and he didn't wince. Instead, his dark, calculating eyes locked entirely onto her face, tracking the subtle shift of her eyelashes. The silence stretched, heavy and charged with sudden electricity, and she could feel the steady, intense heat radiating from his chest, grounding her amidst the chaos, while the sharp metallic tang of blood mixed heavily with his expensive sandalwood cologne. Mila focused intently on the small cut, trying to ignore the way his gaze felt like a physical weight on her skin. "Julian's father sent them to get the marriage contract," she murmured, needing to break the quiet. "I am aware," Daewon replied, his voice a low, resonant vibration that she felt deep in her chest. Slowly, his large hand lifted from his thigh, and his long fingers wrapped gently but firmly around her wrist, halting her movements. "They will never make it onto this floor again." He didn't let go of her arm, his thumb brushing slowly across her racing pulse point. the strictly professional distance they had agreed upon evaporating entirely in the quiet hum of the high-rise penthouse. The ruined white tulle was gone, replaced by a sleek, floor-length column of deep emerald silk. Mila stood before the massive vanity mirror in Daewon's master suite, adjusting the high, asymmetrical neckline. The heavy fabric clung flawlessly to her frame, transforming her from a betrayed bride into the formidable new matriarch of the Shadow Syndicate. Daewon emerged from his adjacent dressing room, the severe tailoring of his black tuxedo absorbing the ambient light. He crossed the thick carpet without a sound, stopping directly behind her reflection. In his hands, he held an open velvet box, and inside lay a heavy, vintage diamond collar. He didn't ask for permission as he lifted the priceless stones, leaning in dangerously close. His knuckles grazed the sensitive skin at the nape of her neck as he fastened the intricate clasp. The metal was startlingly cold, but the steady heat radiating from his chest against her back was entirely distracting. "The Syndicate elders expect obedience," Daewon murmured, his voice a low, resonant vibration near her ear. "You will give them nothing but absolute authority." Mila met his dark, calculating gaze in the mirror. "And what do I give your nephew?" Daewon's hands slid from the clasp, resting briefly, heavily, on her bare shoulders. "No mercy." An hour later, the heavy brass doors of the Continental Hotel's grand ballroom swung open. The low hum of 100 elite, dangerous guests ceased instantly. Daewon guided Mila down the sweeping marble staircase, his hand anchored firmly to the curve of her waist. The physical contact was a clear, unmistakable warning to every criminal empire in the room. She was untouchable. Mila navigated the predatory crowd with the same ruthless efficiency she used to manage chaotic corporate events. She nodded politely, offered nothing, and let the terrifying reputation of the man beside her do the heavy lifting. Across the room, standing near a towering champagne pyramid, stood Julian. He looked haggard, his tuxedo poorly fitted, his usual arrogant posture entirely dissolved. The proxy shares were gone, and with them, his entire safety net. Every time he tried to approach, the menacing presence of Daewon's security detail forced him back. The stifling atmosphere eventually demanded a reprieve, and, taking advantage of Daewon being pulled into a private conversation with a rival boss, Mila slipped away from the main floor. She stepped out onto the expansive, dimly lit stone terrace, letting the cool night air soothe the heat blooming under her skin. She hadn't been alone for more than 10 seconds before the heavy glass door clicked shut behind her. "You look incredible," a desperate, entirely unwanted voice whispered. Mila turned, finding Julian blocking the exit to the ballroom, his eyes wild and completely delusional. "Mila, please," he begged, taking a step closer into the shadows. "I know he forced you. Just tell me you want to come back to me, and I will get us out of here." Mila did not retreat into the shadows, instead standing her ground on the flagstone terrace, letting the humid night breeze brush against the heavy emerald silk of her gown. Julian looked pathetic. The man she had almost married was sweating profusely, the sharp lines of his face sagging with a mixture of terror and absolute entitlement. "Get us out of here?" Mila repeated, her voice laced with a terrifying, calm amusement. "Julian, you don't even have the security clearance to validate your own parking ticket anymore." He flinched, taking another desperate step forward and reaching out a trembling hand. "You don't understand what my uncle is. He's a monster. He only married you to strip my inheritance." "And it worked flawlessly," Mila replied, smoothly swatting his hand away before it could soil the immaculate fabric of her dress. "He secured the trust, and I secured a front-row seat to your financial ruin. It is the most functional relationship I have ever been in." Julian's mouth opened and closed, his delusion fracturing against her absolute apathy. He had expected tears, bitter anger, or at least a frantic negotiation, but he had not anticipated a stone wall. "You were sleeping with Chloe in an electrical closet 10 minutes before our ceremony," Mila continued, her tone dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "Do not stand on this balcony and pretend you are trying to rescue me. You are only here because your credit cards are declining, and you are terrified." In the deep shadows near the ivy-draped perimeter of the terrace, Daewon stood perfectly still. He had followed her out immediately, his hand resting instinctively on the concealed weapon beneath his tuxedo jacket, fully prepared to throw his nephew over the stone railing. But as he watched Mila systematically dismantle Julian's remaining dignity, his grip relaxed. A dark, possessive fascination settled heavily in his chest, realizing she didn't need a savior, because she was holding the blade herself. "Mila, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking as his knees gave out, dropping him onto the hard stone. "I have nothing." "Then you finally have exactly what you deserve," she stated softly. She turned her back on him, dismissing his existence entirely, and reached for the heavy brass handle of the ballroom door. Before her fingers could graze the metal, the muffled symphony of the orchestra inside abruptly died. The glowing chandeliers visible through the glass went completely dark. A split second later, the ambient exterior lights of the terrace snapped off, plunging the entire penthouse level of the Continental into pitch blackness. The heavy, sudden silence was instantly shattered by the deafening, unmistakable sound of automatic gunfire erupting from the ballroom. The heavy brass door shattered inward before Mila could process the blackout. Shards of glass rained across the terrace, accompanied by the chaotic, echoing screams of the city's elite scrambling inside the pitch-black ballroom. Julian shrieked, a high, panicked sound, and crawled blindly toward the ivy-draped railing, entirely useless, but Mila didn't freeze. Years of managing catastrophic event failures had trained her to immediately drop low. She crouched against the cold stone balustrade, her hands gathering the heavy emerald silk of her gown to free her legs for a sprint. Before she could calculate a route to the exterior service stairs, a massive, solid weight boxed her into the corner. The familiar, sharp scent of expensive sandalwood and freshly expelled gunpowder flooded her senses. A large hand clamped securely over her mouth, while a strong arm wrapped completely around her waist, pulling her flush against a rigid, tailored chest. "It is me," a low, gravelly voice vibrated directly against her ear. "Daewon, do not speak. Move exactly when I move." Mila nodded sharply against his palm, and he released her mouth but kept his arm firmly anchored around her waist, treating her like an absolute extension of his own body. He navigated the chaotic darkness with terrifying precision, guided only by the strobing, bright orange muzzle flashes from the ballroom, slipping past the ruined threshold, leaving Julian whimpering in the humid night air, and vanishing into the labyrinth of the hotel's back-of-house corridors. The atmosphere in the narrow service hallways was thick with dust and the metallic tang of copper. Daewon moved flawlessly, a phantom in his severe tuxedo, guiding her through the blacked-out maze of the catering wing. He didn't offer gentle reassurances, and she didn't ask for them. Their communication was entirely physical, the tight, bruising grip of his fingers directing her path, the intense heat of his body shielding hers at every blind corner. They reached the massive stainless steel expanse of the main prep kitchen just as the heavy double doors at the opposite end kicked open. The erratic, blinding beams of high-powered tactical flashlights swept across the hanging pots. Daewon's hand tightened on her hip, and he shoved her down hard, following her to the slippery tile floor just as a deafening volley of automatic fire ripped through the room. Mila hit the ground, gasping for air, instantly pinned beneath Daewon's solid weight behind a thick steel catering island.
The air above them shredded as bullets tore through the industrial appliances, raining bright orange sparks and scalding water over their makeshift bunker. In the terrifying, confined darkness beneath the counter, Daewon shifted his weight slightly, maintaining maximum coverage over her vital organs. He unholstered his sidearm with a smooth, lethal, metallic click. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his face mere inches from hers, the heat of his rapid breath brushing her cheek. "No," she managed to whisper over the deafening noise of the crossfire. "Good," he murmured, his thumb brushing a stray lock of hair from her eyes. "Because I am down to my last magazine." The deafening roar of Daewon's returning fire bought them exactly 4 seconds, and he didn't waste a fraction of one. His grip on her hip was bruising as he dragged her upright, shoving her through the reinforced steel fire doors just as the tile floor they had occupied disintegrated into dust. They navigated the subterranean service tunnels in a suffocating, breathless sprint until the damp, frigid air of the underground parking garage finally hit her lungs. The armored ride back to the penthouse was a complete vacuum of silence. Mila stared at the city lights blurring past the tinted glass, the heavy emerald silk of her gown now dusted with soot and smelling violently of sulfur. When the private elevator chimed on the 75th floor, the immaculate, quiet isolation of the apartment felt deafening. The adrenaline abruptly evaporated, leaving a volatile, electric exhaustion in its wake. Mila turned on him the second the heavy oak doors sealed shut. "Your last magazine," she stated, her voice remarkably even despite the sudden, violent tremor in her hands. "You took me to a public venue knowing your perimeter was compromised." Daewon discarded his ruined tuxedo jacket, letting the expensive fabric drop to the marble floor. His chest was heaving, the pristine white of his shirt smeared with ash. "The perimeter was secured by my men. Julian's father leveraged a foreign cartel to bypass the hotel's security." "Which means you miscalculated," Mila snapped, stepping toward him, completely incinerating the polite, contractual distance they had meticulously maintained all week. "I am not a naive asset you can just tuck behind a catering counter, Daewon. If I am going to wear this collar, I need the reality of the threat, not a shield." Daewon's dark eyes flared, and the lethal, calculated composure he wore like armor finally cracked. He crossed the remaining space between them in a single, predatory stride, forcing her backward until her spine met the solid, unyielding wood of the front doors. He boxed her in, his large hands planting heavily against the oak on either side of her face. The heat radiating from his chest was entirely consuming, trapping her in his gravity. "You think I viewed you as a simple asset tonight?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a raw, ragged vibration that she felt down to her bones. "I left my entire syndicate blind in that ballroom just to ensure you didn't catch a single stray bullet." Mila opened her mouth to argue, but the suffocating proximity stole the air directly from her lungs. He wasn't looking at her like a business arrangement anymore. His gaze dropped to her mouth, dark, heavy, and completely unhinged. Before she could draw another breath, Daewon eliminated the final inch between them. The collision of their mouths was not gentle. It was a violent, demanding sequence born entirely of adrenaline and lingering terror. Daewon's hands tangled in the sleek hair at the nape of her neck, anchoring her in place, while Mila twisted her fingers into his ash-stained shirt, pulling him impossibly closer. The pristine quiet of the penthouse dissolved beneath the ragged sound of their breathing, the heavy emerald silk of her gown rustling against the dark oak door. The suffocating gravity between them only snapped when the sharp, repetitive vibration of a cell phone pierced the room. Daewon broke the connection, resting his forehead against hers, his chest heaving, his dark eyes heavily hooded and entirely unreadable. Mila stepped sideways,
her pulse hammering relentlessly against her ribs, and retrieved her phone from the marble console. The screen illuminated her face in the dim foyer with an encrypted message from an unknown number. An image loaded, and the air vanished from Mila's lungs. Her younger brother, Leo, was bound to a rusted metal chair in a damp concrete room, his face bruised and terrified. Beneath the image, a single line of text glowed. "I have nothing left to lose. Bring the signed annulment to the shipyard in 30 minutes, or he doesn't leave. Come alone." Daewon stepped closer, the lethal composure rapidly returning to his posture. "Who is it?" A lesser woman would have dropped the device and wept. A naive bride would have handed the phone to the terrifying man standing beside her and begged for salvation. Mila did neither, as the remnants of her panic evaporated, replaced instantly by a freezing, absolute clarity. Julian had crossed the final boundary. He was no longer a pathetic, bankrupt nuisance. He was a fatal liability that required immediate liquidation. "My assistant," Mila lied smoothly, locking the screen and slipping the phone into her silk clutch, confirming the event staff survived the blackout. Daewon studied her profile for a fraction of a second, but the sheer exhaustion of the night masked her deceit. "I need to contact the syndicate elders on a secure line," he murmured, turning toward his private study. "Lock the doors. Let no one on this floor." The moment the heavy study doors clicked shut, Mila moved. She crossed the foyer to the side table where Daewon had emptied his pockets upon entering. Resting next to his silver money clip was his backup piece, a compact, matte black semi-automatic. Mila picked up the weapon, the metal heavy and shockingly cold against her palm, but her hands did not shake. She checked the magazine with a sharp, practiced slide, a mechanical skill she had acquired long before she ever met the Johnson family. Slipping the heavy firearm into the deep pocket of Daewon's discarded black tuxedo jacket, she draped the ruined silk lapels over her gown and walked silently toward the private elevator. The rusted gates of the abandoned shipyard offered zero resistance as the rideshare dropped Mila at the perimeter. The air here was entirely different from the sterile altitude of the penthouse, thick with salt, decaying metal, and freezing maritime fog. She navigated the maze of stacked shipping containers, the heavy wool of Daewon's jacket keeping her lethal secret concealed, while her ruined emerald silk swept the oily concrete. Warehouse 4 was illuminated by a single, flickering halogen bulb. Inside, Julian stood near a rusted crane, flanked by 3 nervous men holding cheap firearms. Tied to a metal chair in the center of the damp floor was Leo, bleeding from the lip but very much alive. Julian's chest puffed out the second Mila stepped into the halo of light. "I told you to come alone." "I am alone," Mila replied, her voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. Her tone was flat, completely devoid of the panic he was desperately fishing for. She didn't look at the hired muscle. Her focus was entirely on the pathetic man in the wrinkled tuxedo. "And you are severely overpaying these amateurs." "Where is the annulment?" Julian demanded, taking a step forward and pointing a shaking finger at Leo. "Hand it over, or I give the order." Mila let out a dry, humorless laugh, a cold sound that made the 3 hired men shift uncomfortably. "Julian, you couldn't even give the order to upgrade the floral arrangements without my approval. You think you can command a cartel execution?" She took 2 slow, measured steps toward him. "You didn't kidnap my brother to gain leverage. You kidnapped him because you are a coward trying to lure your uncle into an ambush, and you needed bait. But Daewon isn't here, so your little trap is entirely useless." Julian's face flushed a violent red, the last of his bruised ego flaring. He snatched a weapon from the nearest guard and leveled it at her. "I don't need a trap to kill you, Mila. I will end this right now. Papers, now." Mila didn't flinch, her hand slipping smoothly from the deep pocket of the jacket. The matte black semi-automatic rose in a flawless arc, the metal heavy and steady in her grip, aiming directly at the center of Julian's chest. "I didn't bring any papers," she stated, her finger resting lightly against the trigger. "And I don't miss." Julian laughed, high and hysterical, confident in his numbers. "You think you can take all 4 of us? You're out of your mind." He opened his mouth to shout the order to fire, but the words died instantly. The massive bay doors at the opposite end of the warehouse vanished in a blinding wall of high-beam headlights. The roar of a dozen heavy-duty engines vibrated through the concrete, illuminating Mila from behind and casting her long, terrifying shadow directly over Julian's trembling form. The blinding wall of headlights cut through the damp shipyard fog like a blade, accompanied by the deafening screech of heavy tires locking onto the concrete. A dozen armored SUVs formed an impenetrable barricade across the wide warehouse bay doors. The doors of the lead vehicle opened, and the terrifying, sharp silhouette of Heo Daewon stepped into the harsh halogen glare. He was no longer the meticulously composed billionaire from the boardroom. The ash-smeared dress shirt was gone, replaced by a severe, dark tactical jacket. A dozen heavily armed operatives fanned out in perfect, lethal silence, immediately locking their sights onto Julian and his 3 hired guards. The cheap pistol in Julian's hand began to shake violently. He backed away, his bravado entirely evaporating under the crushing weight of Daewon's arrival. "Shoot them!" Julian shrieked at the 3 men flanking him, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I paid you to protect me." The hired men didn't move a single muscle toward their weapons. They stared at the overwhelming arsenal surrounding them, the brutal reality of their situation setting in. Mila didn't lower her handgun, keeping the barrel trained squarely on Julian's chest, but she shifted her focus slightly toward the hesitant muscle. "He hasn't paid you a single dime yet, has he?" Mila projected her voice, clear and chillingly calm over the low idle of the SUV engines. "He promised you a wire transfer from the family trust once this was over. But that trust was legally liquidated 10 hours ago. Julian is completely bankrupt. His accounts are frozen, his assets are seized, and his own father has abandoned him." The lead guard, a rough man with a heavily scarred neck, slowly turned his head to look at Julian. "She's lying," Julian stammered, sweat pouring down his pale face. "I have the money." "If he had the money," Mila countered smoothly, her tone dripping with lethal logic, "he wouldn't be hiding in a decaying shipyard using an innocent kid as bait. He is entirely worthless. If you raise your weapons, you die tonight for a man who cannot even afford your funeral." The silence that followed was absolute, and then, with a heavy metallic clatter, the lead guard dropped his rifle onto the damp concrete. The other 2 instantly followed suit, raising their hands and stepping far away from the panicked ex-fiancé. Julian let out a pathetic whimper, looking wildly around the empty space his protection had just vacated. Daewon walked forward, his boots making slow, deliberate sounds against the ground, until he stood shoulder to shoulder with Mila. He didn't look at the mercenaries. His dark, cold eyes were fixed entirely on the man who had dared to threaten his wife. With a subtle, terrifying flick of Daewon's wrist, 2 operatives surged forward. They kicked the back of Julian's knees, sending him crashing down onto the wet, oily floor directly at Mila's feet. The impact of Julian's knees hitting the oily concrete echoed sharply through the cavernous warehouse. Stripped of his hired muscle and his family name, he shrank under the blinding glare of the SUV headlights. The arrogant heir Mila had almost married was completely gone, replaced by a trembling, sobbing shell. "Mila, please," Julian choked out, his voice scraping against the damp, freezing air. He crawled a pathetic inch forward, keeping his hands flat on the floor. "They're going to kill me. Tell him to call them off. We were supposed to stand at an altar today. You loved me." Mila stared down at him, and while the heavy wool of Daewon's jacket shielded her from the maritime cold, the absolute zero of her own apathy was what truly insulated her. She didn't feel anger anymore. She only felt a profound, exhausting disgust. Without breaking eye contact with the man on the floor, she smoothly reversed her grip on the matte black semi-automatic and held it out to her right. Daewon took the weapon from her hand seamlessly, their physical synchronization flawless. "I loved a projection, Julian," Mila corrected, her tone as hard and unyielding as the steel shipping containers surrounding them. "I loved a man who didn't exist. The reality is kneeling in a puddle, begging his ex-fiancé to save him from his own spectacular incompetence." She took a deliberate step back, severing the invisible tether of their history entirely. "You are completely bankrupt. You have no shares, no syndicate, and no bride. Do not ever approach my family again." Mila didn't wait for his response, turning her head slightly toward Daewon. "Have him removed. The smell of this harbor is ruining my silk." Daewon did not laugh, but the dark, lethal pride radiating from him was palpable. He gave a microscopic nod to his operatives, and two massive men stepped out of the shadows, gripping Julian by the armpits and hauling him backward into the fog. Julian's frantic, humiliating pleas faded rapidly, swallowed entirely by the roar of an idling engine, until the warehouse fell into a profound, heavy silence. The remaining operatives melted back to the perimeter, leaving Mila and Daewon entirely alone in the center of the damp floor. The blinding headlights clicked off, plunging the space back into the soft, dim glow of the single halogen bulb. The adrenaline crash was immediate and volatile, as Mila swayed slightly, the sheer exhaustion of the past 12 hours suddenly threatening her balance. Daewon crossed the remaining inches between them and didn't just steady her, he enveloped her, pulling her flush against the severe lines of his tactical jacket. One hand anchored firmly against the small of her back, while the other buried itself in the dark, loose strands of her hair. "The proxy shares were secured at the altar," Daewon whispered, his voice a raw, desperate vibration against the shell of her ear. "But I did not marry you for the voting rights, Mila." 6 months dissolved the last remnants of the betrayed bride who had fled into a dark alleyway. Mila sat at the head of the 75th floor boardroom table, the heavy city sunlight catching the flawless diamond collar resting against her throat. She wore a tailored ivory suit, a stark contrast to the ruined tool of her past, commanding the space with absolute, terrifying ease. With a swift stroke of a silver fountain pen, she signed the final liquidation order for the remaining dummy corporations that once belonged to her former fiancé's family. The paper slid across the highly reflective glass to the syndicate attorneys, who collected it with rapid, fearful efficiency before vacating the room. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving only one other person in the sprawling corporate suite. Daewon leaned against the threshold of the private office, wearing a severe charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, his dark eyes tracking her every movement with a heavy, unyielding devotion. He crossed the marble floor silently, stopping at her chair. From his inner pocket, he produced a crisp, folded document and dropped it onto the glass table. Mila glanced at the header, recognizing it was their original marriage arrangement. The annulment clause was dated exactly 6 months from the day she hijacked his Maybach. "Your contractual obligation is officially fulfilled," Daewon stated, his voice a low, resonant hum. He rested his large hands on the arms of her chair, boxing her in. Your accounts hold the agreed-upon millions. The runway is clear if you wish to walk away. Mila picked up the document but didn't look at the text. She looked up at the lethal, untouchable man hovering over her, the man who had burned an entire city block to keep her safe, the man who let her wield his authority as her own. Her lips curved into a sharp, knowing smile as she gripped the thick legal paper and calmly tore it straight down the middle. Daewon's rigid posture shifted instantly as a dark, possessive satisfaction flared in his eyes. He leaned down, capturing her jaw with a warm, steady hand, his thumb brushing over her pulse point. I have no intention of walking away, Daewon, Mila murmured, the velvet tone of her voice matching his own dangerous cadence. She reached up, her fingers sliding into the dark, neat styling of his hair, pulling him down to her level. This city requires a matriarch, and you require someone to manage your messes. Then the contract is void, Daewon whispered against her mouth, eliminating the final fraction of space between them. And the syndicate belongs to you. The collision of their lips sealed the true vow, far more binding than ink on paper. They had started as a brutal, calculating revenge tactic, but as the afternoon sun cast long shadows over their empire, they had forged something entirely unbreakable.